The restaurant's private lounge hummed with low conversation and the clinking of glassware, a familiar backdrop for Brandon Carter as he leaned back in his leather chair. Confidence radiating from him like heat off pavement. Across the table sat his longtime associate, a wealthy investor who joined him for a late dinner after a negotiation meeting downtown. Brandon swirled the bourbon in his glass, smirking as if he were about to unveil some well-guarded secret. "You know," he began, tilting his head just enough to project superiority, "I really did hit the jackpot with Laura." His friend raised an eyebrow, waiting, and Brandon's grin widened. "Most men hope their wife is decent, pretty enough, polite enough. I was smarter. I vetted her. Background, family history, health records, even had her IQ tested before the wedding." The investor choked on a quiet laugh, unsure whether to be impressed or disturbed. Brandon didn't seem to notice. He continued with a wave of his hand, as though he were describing a new acquisition rather than his spouse. "People waste years wondering if they married the right woman. Not me. I made sure. Laura's good stock. Strong genes. Stable temperament. Obedient. Exactly what a man in my position needs." He downed the bourbon, satisfied with himself, and set the glass down with a soft thud. The entitlement in his voice thickened with each word. "And soon enough," he added, "I'll finally get what I want. A son. Someone who can carry the Carter name and everything I've built." His friend shook his head slowly. "You're serious? You don't feel anything for her at all." Brandon scoffed. "Feelings? What do feelings have to do with legacy? Laura's role is simple. She's there to give me a son and keep the household presentable. And she's good at that, compliant, grateful, the quiet type who doesn't cause trouble." For a moment, the friend considered responding, maybe calling out the coldness in Brandon's tone. But Brandon leaned forward, lowering his voice as though revealing something strategic. "And between you and me, she's useful, really useful." His tone shifted ever so, slightly less arrogant, more calculating. "She's got this instinct for business. Reads people frighteningly well. I don't talk about it publicly, no reason for anyone to think she contributes. But she can predict exactly how a partner will move in a deal. I swear, it's like she sees 3 steps ahead. It's been profitable." He straightened again, letting the moment pass before returning to his smug facade. "But I'm not about to let her forget her place. I remind her all the time, without me, she'd still be nobody. She knows it, and she's grateful." Outside the window, downtown Seattle glowed with evening lights reflecting off the glass towers, but the warmth of the city didn't touch him. His friend watched him closely now, noticing the cracks beneath the polished exterior, the insecurity, the fear of being overshadowed, the need to keep Laura small so he could feel large. "Well," the friend said quietly, "I hope you know what you're doing." Brandon smiled a thin, satisfied smile. "I always do." The Carter townhouse in Queen and looked warm from the outside. Soft amber lights glowing through the windows, a manicured walkway lined with potted plants, but inside, the atmosphere felt tight, muted, and carefully restrained. Laura Carter moved through the room softly, like someone afraid to disturb the air. Her world had shrunk to the walls of this house, and Brandon had made sure of it. She no longer met friends for coffee. She no longer visited the bookstore where she once spent quiet afternoons. Brandon insisted it wasn't safe for a pregnant woman to be out alone. And whenever she suggested going somewhere with him, he brushed her off or told her she was being dramatic. Eventually, she stopped asking. Most evenings were spent waiting for him to come home from late meetings, client dinners, or networking events. Laura knew the coded meaning behind those words, but she still greeted him at the door with a soft, practiced smile. Brandon barely looked at her as he shrugged off his coat. "You're up," he'd say, as if her awakeness were somehow inconvenient. I wanted to make sure you made it home okay, she'd answer. He'd chuckle, a low, dismissive sound. Laura, I'm a young guy. I have needs. You can't expect me to sit at home every night just because you're pregnant. No matter how gently she tried to respond, it always ended the same. He'd call her naive, overly sentimental, or not sharp enough to understand how the world works. He repeated those lines so often they began burrowing into her quiet, corrosive threads of doubt. One night, she sat on the edge of the couch, hands folded over her belly, waiting for the right moment to speak. When Brandon came in, smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't hers, she lifted her chin. Brandon, I was thinking, maybe we should schedule an ultrasound, just to know the baby's gender for sure. He stopped mid-stride, turning toward her with an expression that mixed irritation and disbelief. Why would we waste money on that? He demanded. I told you I already know it's a boy. Laura blinked. But we can't know without Laura. His voice cut through the air, sharp enough to make her flinch. Don't say something stupid. I don't want pointless radiation on my son. Drop it. She lowered her gaze, her heartbeat tapping nervously against her ribs. It wasn't the first time he'd silenced her, but something about the firmness in his tone made her shrink a little smaller than before. Brandon, feeling triumphant, walked past her, loosening his tie. Try not to overthink things, he added casually. It's not your strong suit. Laura stayed on the couch long after he disappeared upstairs, her hand resting protectively over her stomach, her eyes fixed on the quiet, dimly lit room. The townhouse felt larger and colder than ever, and somewhere in that silence, the emotional distance between them stretched just a little further. The contractions started before dawn, sharp and unexpected, pulling Laura from a restless sleep. At first she tried to breathe through them, hoping they were false alarm, but within minutes the pain doubled, gripping her in waves so strong she had to brace herself against the nightstand. She called out for Brandon, her voice trembling. He appeared in the doorway, irritated, as if she'd woken him for something trivial. What now? It's time, she whispered, clutching her belly. The contractions, they're close. Brandon cursed under his breath. He had canceled the private maternity suite at Swedish Medical Center 2 days earlier. Too expensive, he'd said, now that he wasn't certain it would be worth it. He hadn't expected labor to come this soon. For a moment, he stood frozen, then grabbed his phone. Fine. I'll call an ambulance, he muttered, pacing as if the inconvenience were personally offensive. The paramedics arrived quickly and helped Laura onto the stretcher. Brandon didn't ride with her. He claimed he needed to follow in his own car, but he never came. The ambulance lights painted the wet Seattle streets in red and blue as it rushed her toward Swedish Medical Center. Hours later, after an exhausting labor supported only by nurses and doctors, Laura gave birth to a small, warm, perfect baby girl. The nurse lifted the newborn gently so Laura could see her. Tears welled instantly. A daughter, the nurse said with a soft smile. She's healthy and beautiful. Laura reached out with shaking hands, pulling her baby close. She had imagined this moment for months. The weight, the warmth, the fierce, sudden love. She whispered to her daughter, Mia, the name she had chosen quietly and carried close to her heart. The door swung open. Brandon stepped inside, his expression unreadable at first. Then his gaze landed on the pink blanket wrapped around Mia's tiny form. His face twisted. You've got to be kidding me. Laura stiffened. Brandon, she's here. She's a girl. His voice rose sharply, echoing off the hospital walls. You gave me a girl. Laura blinked back tears. I didn't choose. Don't, he snapped, pointing a finger at her as though she were a disobedient child. Don't say another word. You deceived me. You promised me a son. You ruined everything. The nurse in the corner shifted uneasily, but Brandon continued pacing like a caged animal, running both hands through his hair. His fury filled the room, boiling over into frantic muttering. This can't be happening. A girl? After everything? You had one job, and you couldn't even do that. Laura tightened her hold on Mia, instinctively shielding the infant from the storm of anger. She was exhausted, her body trembling, her heart cracking open under the weight of his rejection. Brandon, she whispered, she's our daughter. He barked a bitter laugh. Yours, not mine. Then, refusing even to look at the baby, he turned away, his rage settling into something colder, more dangerous, as if Mia's existence were a personal attack rather than a miracle. Laura looked down at her daughter, tears slipping silently onto the blanket. In her arms, Mia slept peacefully, unaware that her very existence had already shattered the fragile world her mother lived in. The recovery room was quiet except for the soft hum of equipment and the rhythmic breaths of the newborn lying against Laura's chest. Mia's tiny fingers curled around the fabric of her mother's gown, oblivious to the storm that had erupted only moments earlier. Laura tried to steady herself, pressing a trembling kiss to her daughter's forehead. The door opened again. Brandon stepped inside with a stiffness that made the air tighten. His earlier rage had cooled into something far more unsettling, a calculated coldness, as if he had already rehearsed what he intended to say. We're going to fix this, he announced, standing over the bed. There's still a way out. Laura blinked, exhaustion clouding her vision. Brandon, please, just sit. Talk to me. He ignored the plea. You're going to leave her here. Her breath caught. What? If you want to come home, he said, voice clipped. You'll walk out of this hospital without that baby. We'll try again, this time for a real heir. For a moment, the world tilted. Laura stared at him, unable to form words. She pulled Mia closer, instinctively shielding her daughter as if from a physical blow. Brandon, she whispered, she's ours. She's our child. He scoffed, pacing to the end of the bed. She's not what I planned for, and I'm not wasting years raising something that won't carry my name forward. You leave her here. You come home and we start over. Simple. Laura shook her head, slowly, horror creeping through her chest. I can't. She needs me. She's barely a few hours old. She needs her mother. Brandon's gaze hardened, his voice dipping to a blade's edge. Then you both go. If you walk out of here with that girl, you and your little mistake can figure out life on the street. The finality in his tone sent a cold shiver through her. Laura's hands tightened around Mia, her heart throbbing painfully beneath her ribs. She felt trapped, cornered by a man who had never truly seen her as anything more than a vessel for his ambitions. A knock came at the door. 2 members of the ambulance crew, the same ones who had brought her in, stepped inside, checking paperwork for her transfer to a postpartum room. Brandon glanced at them, then waved his hand dismissively. Take her. I have things to do. One of the EMTs frowned. Sir, aren't you coming with her? No, Brandon said, already moving toward the exit. I'll show up later. He didn't look back. Not at Laura, not at Mia. Not at the life he was so willing to discard. The door shut behind him with a soft but devastating click. Laura was lifted gently onto the transport stretcher. As they rolled her down the hallway, she held Mia close, tears slipping silently onto the infant's blanket. The fluorescent lights above blurred through her tears. She rode alone toward the hospital's maternity wing, clutching her daughter as if she were the last fragile piece of hope she had left. The next morning, the streets of downtown Seattle buzzed with early commuters, the kind who clutched coffee cups and hurried toward office towers glazed with morning light. Daniel Brooks stepped out of his SUV, adjusting the sleeves of his coat as he prepared for a brief meeting in the building ahead. He was checking a message on his phone when a familiar voice called out. Daniel, hey! Brandon Carter strode toward him across the plaza, wearing the same expensive suit he always did, but something in his expression looked off, unsettled. Daniel noticed, instantly. Brandon was usually arrogant, composed, almost smugly polished. Today he seemed irritated, restless. "Morning," Daniel said carefully. "Didn't expect to see you here this early." Brandon let out a humorless laugh. "Early start. Still haven't become a father, you know." Daniel paused, frowning. "I heard Laura went into labor yesterday. Isn't everything okay?" Brandon waved a dismissive hand. "She had the baby, but not a real one. A daughter doesn't count." His tone dripped with disappointment, as if he were complaining about a delayed shipment, not the birth of his child. Daniel's jaw tightened. "A daughter doesn't count," he repeated slowly, disbelief threading through every word. Brandon shrugged. "I told her we'd try again. I'm not raising something that won't carry the name forward." He glanced at his watch, clearly done with the conversation. "Anyway, I've got things to do." Daniel watched him walk off, his stomach knotting. Something was wrong, deeply, viscerally wrong. Brandon's carelessness was nothing new, but this cold dismissal of both mother and newborn felt darker than anything he'd heard from him before. He exhaled, steadying himself. Memories he had buried long ago began to surface. His late wife, pale and trembling, laboring in a small hospital years earlier. He remembered holding her hand as complications spiraled out of control. The chaos, the alarms, and the unbearable stillness afterward. She had never made it out of that room. Their unborn daughter hadn't either. Daniel swallowed hard, grounding himself. He knew what it meant for a woman to face childbirth alone. What it meant for no one to be there when she needed it most. If Brandon had spoken so casually about not being a father, what did that mean for Laura? Had he even stayed with her? Had he abandoned her in the middle of labor? The thought made Daniel's pulse quicken. He pulled out his phone. "Seattle Maternity Hospitals near me," he muttered, scrolling through the results. There were several options, but only a few made sense based on the ambulance routes in Queen and Swedish Medical Center, First Hill. The most likely. He didn't hesitate. He turned back toward his SUV, heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. Something told him Laura might be alone, and if she was... He refused to let her face that moment the way he once had. He got in the car, started the engine, and drove toward the hospital, hoping he wasn't too late. Daniel walked through the bright corridors of Swedish Medical Center, the scent of antiseptic and the distant beeping of monitors guiding him deeper into the maternity wing. He paused at the nurse's station, politely asking if a patient named Laura Carter had been admitted the night before. After a moment of checking records, the nurse pointed him toward a quiet room at the end of the hall. He approached slowly, unsure what he would find. When he reached the doorway, he saw her. Laura sat propped up in the hospital bed, her hair slightly damp from sweat, face pale with exhaustion. Yet there was a softness in her expression, a fragile tenderness, as she gazed down at the tiny newborn resting against her chest. Mia's small hand clung to the edge of her mother's gown with instinctive trust. Daniel hesitated, then lightly tapped the doorframe. "Laura." She startled, her head lifting quickly. When she recognized him, confusion flickered across her face. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" He stepped inside slowly, careful not to intrude. In his hands was a bouquet of pale pink roses, dewy and fresh, along with a bag filled with newborn essentials, diapers, wipes, a soft blanket, bottles of water, and a few snacks, things she clearly didn't have. "I hope this isn't inappropriate," he said gently. I wanted to check on you, and bring a few things." Laura stared at the items with a stunned expression, then looked back at him with wide, tired eyes. "That's very kind. Thank you." Daniel set the flowers on the small table beside her, placing the bag on the chair. Then he paused, maintaining a respectful distance. "May I?" he asked quietly, gesturing toward Mia. Laura nodded, her movements small and delicate. She's sleeping, she whispered. But yes, you can look. Daniel approached slowly, leaning slightly to gaze at the tiny infant. Mia's eyelashes were impossibly fine, her cheeks soft and pink, her features gentle and peaceful. He exhaled softly. She's beautiful, he murmured. Truly. Laura smiled faintly, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Something heavy lingered beneath the surface. Fear, confusion, maybe even shame. Daniel sensed it. Laura, was everything okay yesterday? Her breath trembled. She looked down at her daughter, brushing a fingertip across Mia's cheek. Brandon, she swallowed hard. He canceled the private suite. And he never came with me. He said he was busy. Her voice wavered. When he came later and saw I'd had a girl, he told me to leave her here. That, if I didn't, we'd both end up on the street. Daniel's chest tightened. He said that. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. He doesn't want her. He doesn't even want to look at her. For a moment, Daniel closed his eyes, steadying the ache in his chest. He pulled a chair closer, but left space, not wanting to overwhelm her. Laura, he said softly, years ago, my wife went into labor. There were complications. I lost her and our daughter. His voice thickened, but he kept it steady. Since then, I can't stand the thought of a mother facing that alone. No one should go through this without support. Laura looked at him, her lips parting in quiet surprise. So, if you need anything, visits, supplies, someone to talk to, I'm here, he continued. No expectations, no pressure, just help. She hesitated, torn between caution and the raw need for kindness she hadn't felt in months. But Daniel's sincerity was unmistakable, steady, warm, without judgment. And for the first time since Mia's birth, Laura felt the smallest breath of relief. When Daniel left the hospital that evening, the Seattle sky had already turned a deep slate gray. The drizzle was light but constant, tapping against his windshield as he sat in the parking lot and tried to steady his breath. He couldn't shake the image of Laura, the exhaustion etched across her face, the quiet way she held Mia as if shielding the newborn from a world already too harsh. The moment he reached his home office in Bellevue, he logged into his computer and opened his calendar. Meetings, calls, contracts, most of them tied to joint ventures with Brandon Carter's company. One by one, Daniel canceled them. Every partnership, every future negotiation. The man had crossed a line Daniel couldn't ignore. He tried to sleep afterward, but his mind wouldn't rest. He lay awake in his king-size bed, staring at the ceiling while rain brushed the windows. Thoughts kept circling. Laura was still in that hospital room. Eventually, she would be discharged. And Brandon had made it painfully clear she wasn't welcome home, unless she abandoned her daughter. The idea made Daniel sit up abruptly, running a hand through his hair. Laura had nowhere to go, no family nearby, no friends Brandon hadn't isolated her from. She had a newborn who needed warmth, diapers, stability, someone to watch over them both. By the time the sky softened into dawn, he had made up his mind. Laura and Mia were not going back to Brandon's house. Not if he could help it. He showered quickly, grabbed a set of keys, and drove back toward Swedish Medical Center, his chest tight with a mixture of nerves and determination. He rehearsed his words during the entire trip, unsure how she would react. He only knew he had to try. When he arrived at Laura's door, he knocked gently. She looked up from the rocking chair, Mia asleep against her shoulder. Her eyes widened when she saw him. Daniel? You're back already. Is everything okay? He stepped inside, his voice steady but soft. I've been thinking a lot since yesterday. Thinking about how Brandon left you. And what happens when the hospital discharges you. Laura blinked, confusion and worry flickering across her face. I'll figure something out, she murmured, though even she didn't sound convinced. I don't want to impose on anyone. Daniel shook his head. You're not imposing. He took a slow breath. Laura, I have a big house in Bellevue. Plenty of space. A spare room that can be set up for you and Mia today. You don't have to go back to Brandon. Not even for a minute. Her expression froze, stunned. Daniel, I can't just move into your home. It wouldn't look right. People would assume things. And I'm still married. It's not about what it looks like, he said gently. It's about safety, stability. You need a roof over your head. Mia needs one even more. He met her gaze directly. And the moment you're ready, you should file for divorce. I'll help you through the process if you want. Laura looked down at her daughter, brushing a thumb across Mia's soft cheek. Fear and exhaustion warred inside her. The uncertainty of stepping into a stranger's home, the terror of having no other place to go. Then she looked back at Daniel. His expression held no pressure, no hidden agenda, just a steady, honest sincerity she hadn't felt in months, maybe years. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she answered. Yes, we'll come. Daniel exhaled softly, relief washing through him. They had a plan now. And for the first time since Mia's birth, Laura wasn't facing the world alone. Back at his downtown office, Brandon Carter paced in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, jaw clenched, phone in hand. The skyline shimmered against the late-morning haze, but Brandon barely noticed. Something was unraveling, faster than he could contain it. It started with a missed call from a major partner, then another. By noon, 3 meetings had been rescheduled, 2 contracts put under review, and one investor sent him a curt message. We need to pause further discussions for now. Brandon stared at the screen, disbelief twisting into anger. This makes no damn sense, he muttered. Everything was fine last week. But things weren't fine, and deep down he knew the reason. Laura, quiet, observant, intuitive Laura, had been the subtle engine behind his best deals. Her ability to sense people's motives, to weigh risks, to anticipate moves, all of it had made him look smarter than he was. Without her, he was exposed, and rumors were spreading. Whispers of how he treated her, how he'd abandoned her during labor, how he demanded she leave her newborn behind. Seattle's business community wasn't sentimental, but it had standards, and Brandon had crossed a line. By mid-afternoon, frustration spilled into panic. He slammed his phone onto the desk. Unbelievable, he hissed. They're acting like I'm the problem. He began pacing again, anger escalating. His thoughts snapped toward the same conclusion. He needed Laura back. Not for love, not even for family, but because without her, everything he'd built felt unstable. He needed her mind, her instincts, her quiet calculations. She'll come home, he muttered. She has to. She owes me. Brandon grabbed his car keys, still seething, then stopped at a boutique florist on his way out of the city. The clerk handed him a large bouquet of roses, assuming they were for a joyful occasion. He didn't bother correcting her. As he drove toward Swedish Medical Center, he rehearsed excuses and revisions of the truth. I was stressed. You misunderstood me. Let's start over. Come home and we'll talk about the baby. He practiced each line aloud, adjusting his tone until he sounded almost convincing. By the time he reached First Hill, he had built an entire narrative in his mind, one where he was the reasonable husband, Laura the emotional wife who had blown things out of proportion. He parked across from the hospital, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the entrance with narrowed eyes. He wasn't there to apologize. He was there to retrieve a resource he believed belonged to him. Brandon stepped out of the car, straightened his jacket, and picked up the bouquet. His expression hardened into something polished and performative, the mask he wore so well. He had no idea that Laura was no longer alone, and at the moment he walked through those doors, the illusion of control he clung to would begin to crumble for good. Brandon had been waiting near the entrance to Swedish Medical Center for almost half an hour, bouquet clutched tightly in one hand, irritation growing by the minute. He kept checking his watch, rehearsing his carefully crafted lines in his head, imagining how Laura would melt the moment she saw him concerned and apologetic. But then a familiar SUV turned into the hospital driveway, rolling to a stop near the curb. Daniel Brooks. Brandon stiffened. His grip on the flowers tightened. What the? Before he could finish the thought, Daniel stepped out of the driver's seat. He rounded the vehicle and opened the back door. And there she was, Laura, her hair tied loosely back, her hospital wristband still on, her posture tired but steady. She held a bouquet of roses, Daniel's roses, against her chest. She looked fragile but not broken. And in Daniel's arms was Mia, swaddled securely in a soft blanket, her tiny face visible through the lace-trimmed edges. Brandon froze, his breath snagged in his throat. For a moment, disbelief pinned him in place. Then fury detonated. He stormed across the courtyard, nearly trampling the landscaping. What the hell is going on? Laura flinched at the sound of his voice, instinctively stepping closer to Daniel. Daniel shifted slightly, angling his body protectively between her and Brandon. Brandon jabbed a finger toward him. Where do you think you're taking my wife and my child? Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He simply met Brandon's eyes with a calm, steady resolve that made Brandon's outrage look small. You abandoned them, Daniel said. You told Laura to leave her newborn in this hospital. You made it clear she wasn't welcome in your home. That's not your twisting, Brandon sputtered, his face blotched with anger. She's my wife. She should be with me. And that, he pointed sharply at the baby, that is my daughter, whether I wanted her or not. Laura winced. Daniel didn't. He adjusted Mia gently in his arms, keeping the newborn close. You gave up the right to talk about her like she's property the moment you tried to force Laura to abandon her. Brandon scoffed, desperate to regain ground. Oh, I get it now, he sneered. You've wanted her for yourself this whole time. That's why you're playing hero. You think taking in a desperate woman makes you some kind of savior. Daniel didn't rise to the bait. This isn't about me, he said calmly. This is about her safety and your cruelty. Brandon's chest heaved. Panic flickered behind his rage. He needed Laura back. He needed her mind, her instincts, her quiet intelligence. Without her, his business was collapsing. Daniel was stealing the one thing he couldn't replace. You're making a huge mistake, Brandon snarled. Laura, get away from him. Now. Laura didn't move. Her fingers tightened around the roses she held. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. I'm leaving, Brandon. I'm not going back. For a split second, Brandon seemed genuinely stunned, as if he had never considered the possibility that she might choose herself. Daniel stepped forward, his tone low, controlled, and unmistakably firm. Listen carefully. If you interfere with her life from here on out, if you threaten her, if you show up at her door, if you try to use your business or your name to intimidate her, you will lose far more than a marriage. I promise you that. Brandon stared at him, speechless, chest rising and falling in short, furious bursts. Daniel guided Laura into the SUV, handing Mia gently to her before closing the door. He walked around to the driver's side, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb without looking back. Brandon stood frozen on the walkway, the bouquet of flowers drooping in his hand, watching as the woman he once believed he controlled disappeared into the distance, safe, protected, and beyond his reach. 6 months passed, and Seattle's winter gray slowly gave way to the soft bloom of spring. But for Brandon Carter, the passing of time had brought no renewal, only unraveling. At first, he tried to salvage his image by spreading rumors. He told colleagues Laura had been unfaithful. He claimed she ran off with Daniel Brooks long before the baby was born. He insisted he was the victim of a calculated betrayal, but no one bought it. People remembered how he'd acted at the hospital. The ambulance crew talked. A nurse mentioned he never once visited Laura. Business partners whispered that his wife had delivered alone because he had other priorities. The story spread quietly through Seattle's business circles, and every version made Brandon look worse. Investors pulled out. Collaborations froze. Contracts dissolved one after another. It didn't take long for Brandon's company to begin collapsing in on itself. Numbers dipped, then plunged. His once impressive office downsized. Employees transferred or resigned. And the same people he used to impress at high-end restaurants avoided him at networking events. By spring, Brandon Carter, once loud, polished, puffed with arrogance, found himself sitting alone in his smaller, dimmer office, staring at spreadsheets he could no longer fix. The silence around him was suffocating. He tried blaming Laura. He tried blaming Daniel. He even tried blaming the economy. But the truth lingered like a shadow he couldn't escape. He had destroyed his own life with his own hands. One afternoon, while scrolling through the local news, mostly out of habit, partly out of boredom, he froze as a headline caught his eye. A Bellevue celebration. Tech investor Daniel Brooks marries Laura Carter in a private garden ceremony. Brandon's breath hitched. He clicked the link. There on the screen, under strings of soft white lights and blooming spring flowers, stood Laura. She wore an ivory dress that moved gently in the breeze, her hair in loose waves. A soft smile lifting her lips. Happiness radiated from her, not loud or showy, but steady, grounded, unmistakably real. Beside her stood Daniel, strong and calm, holding Mia in his arms. The little girl, now 6 months old, slept peacefully against his chest, a tiny floral headband resting above her closed eyes. They looked like a family. Brandon's hands tightened around the mouse. His jaw clenched until it ached. He searched the crowd in the photo, hoping to spot someone who looked uncertain. Someone who might be judging, doubting, whispering criticism. There was no one. Everyone in attendance wore warmth on their faces, friends, neighbors. A few business acquaintances of Daniel's, people who clearly supported the couple and adored the baby. The article described the event as intimate and joyful, a celebration of resilience and new beginnings. Brandon leaned back in his chair, the cheap leather creaking beneath him. The office around him was silent, stripped down, almost hollow. His phone hadn't rung in hours. He hadn't received a serious email in days. He stared at the photo again. Laura's smile wasn't triumphant. It wasn't vengeful. It wasn't even directed at him. It was the smile of someone who had escaped a storm and found a place where the air was finally warm again. Daniel stood beside her, protective without being possessive, steady without overshadowing her. Mia slept trustingly in his arms, as though she had been in them her entire life. A slow, bitter realization seeped into Brandon's chest, heavy and cold. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the only person who ever believed in him. He had lost the daughter he never cared to know. He had lost his reputation, his business, and the admiration he once chased. And worst of all, no one mourned the loss with him. No one cared that he had fallen. No one was coming to save him or offer sympathy. Brandon Carter faded quietly into irrelevance, swallowed by the silence he had earned. Meanwhile, in a sunlit Bellevue garden, surrounded by warmth and second chances, Laura began the life she had always deserved, one built on dignity, safety, and a love that finally saw her.